with a return and say that it returns an array of strings. And then if you look again down here, if we see IntelliSense, you'll see that this shows us that it returns the array of strings, so we're recognizing it. I can use it in my own code. Another change that's kind of fun to see with a bigger library or file like Angular is our navigation bar that's just been, you might have seen it up at the top of the screen. It's new in this release.
Right.
It's got, first there's this global, this is the drop-down we call the containers, important containers for your app. This global container is a place you can go for sort of a classic list of functions in the file. So if you're one that just has a bunch of functions in your file you want to navigate between, you could use that. Or we also have some analysis of your code to pull out what might be important elements in the file for you. So for example, there's this Angular object. This is that Angular.module I was writing. This lets me see what is attached to this Angular object on the global of your application. So I could see in here all these members available to me. You'll see the Angular.module is in here. And so we're recognizing common JavaScript patterns to pull into that containers list. We also have it customized for Angular so that if you are using your own controller or a service, those get pulled out explicitly. So now if I'm in a larger file, I could jump around to any of the services in here or my controller functions.
Cool. Very cool.
So another area of a lot of focus in this release was, mentioned earlier, the ECMAScript 2015 or ES6 or ES 2015, a few ways you could refer to it. Microsoft Edge, the new browser we've got, has support for a good set of ES 2015, and we've got the same support in Visual Studio. And so we've got, here I'll give you an example of converting a little bit of code to ES 2015.
Okay.
So for example, let's see, one thing they've got is item called Lambda functions. So if you look at our code here, you'll notice I got the function keyword. A Lambda function is simply, you could write it out like that. So this is what we would call a fat arrow. And you just define this function. It gives you some benefits of working with, beyond just, more terse syntax. It's also got some benefits around the how you work with like the this object. So if you're familiar with, sometimes you've written code that may say var that equals this to control the scope of this throughout your code. Lambda is what they call lexically scoped. So it takes the this object from kind of the code around it. You could think of it that way. So for example, in this outer function, I could assign a value to a. And inside of my Lambda here, when I say this dot, it's that same this property. So you don't have extra work where you're doing function.bind or .apply that you may have done in the past. So it's kind of a nicety of using that. I'm going to keep it simple, and we're just going to use it and say it's because I like the new brief syntax.
It's less typing.
Sometimes that's all we want, right? So I'll save these changes and refresh the code. The app should still work. I fixed our image earlier, right? No, I didn't. So that's still working. That's fine. Now, Edge supports this Lambda syntax, but a lot of people were still building for browsers that may not support that. Older versions of IE or Firefox, for example. So you usually want to add in something to your workflow that's going to do what we call a transpiling. It would take that source, turn it from ES 2015 into ES 5.1, one of the more widely supported versions of JavaScript, and that's what you would send to production.
Okay.
So how I've configured my project here is I'm using, I have this task, watch task running that's monitoring my source code and turning it into that ES 5.1 source code that I deploy to the browser. And I'm doing this through a task runner called Gulp, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I'm using this new feature in VS 2015, that's the Task Runner Explorer, which gives you a way to visualize the task runner. So for example, here I have this watch task running. And so every time I save a change to my file, let's say I put in a bad character, this is running for us, and here it saw an error in my code. So this thing is just watching my code as I go and turning it into the ES 5.1, and I could refresh my browser and it works right away. I don't have a build step in Visual Studio that I'm manually kicking off every time. So the way I did that is, I mentioned Gulp. So I have this gulpfile.js. I've gone through some steps to use, to set up Gulp through node tools or NPM the Node package manager that
Yep.
we have integration for this in VS 2015. And I set my project up with gulp. And this is an example of a gulp file that you can think of it as using JavaScript to define a build script.
Okay.
So we've got a good bit of information. Mads Christensen has talked about these features a bit before, so if somebody's new to that, that'd be a good thing to go take a look at. But in brief, what my build task in here is doing is looking at all of my files in the scripts folder, concatenates them into an all.js file, and then it runs it through something called Babel, which is a third-party open source transpiler. It's also previously known as 6to5.
Okay.
That it's able to take like ES 2015 code and turn it into ES 5.1 or other versions.
Now,
and
is
so I
that
run it
something
through
that Visual Studio installs, or do you go get that yourself?
I chose to get it myself.
Okay.
So if you look in our package.json file through npm, I said that I want to include gulp.babel, so it brought it down for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it runs through Babel to do that transpilation, and then ultimately it will be output to this www.root app folder. And if you look here in www.root app, there's our JavaScript that's actually running in my browser. And so here, where we had a Lambda function, you'll see that it was just turned into a function statement.
Okay.
And I've also defined this watch task. This is what's actually watching for the changes and running that build task for me automatically. So I set this up one time and kind of set it off to the side, and you've seen, as I've been making changes here, I haven't had to think about it, but my code's being transpiled and pushed to the browser, and all that's kind of just happening for me. So one more quick example of that is, let's say, if in my code I want to use the class syntax in ES 2015, and we're just going to have a constructor. I could fill this out, use a class, and here my all.js file is being updated by that watch task. If we look, you will see down at the bottom there's this kind of stub code that makes it act like a class when you run it in browsers that don't support the class syntax.
Okay.
So it gives me a way to use ES 2015 now across more browsers than may actually support it.
So Visual Studio ships with support for ES 2015?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. So you could, if you're just targeting browsers that already support the ES 2015 features you want to use, there's no need for a transpiler. Just you can use the editor and have at it. Otherwise, if you do need to support browsers that don't have them so far, you may layer in something like Babel. TypeScript would be another option, so we'll hit on that right at the end here.
Right.
So one last thing to hit on JavaScript real quick is I want to note another popular library that we have support for by default in the product. So if we look in here, this is require.js. So require.js is a popular module loader library that seems a little bit similar to Angular, where at runtime it gets your dependencies and binds them all together. Require.js lets you split your code up into different modules and then load those dynamically as you run your app. But those could be requests that go back to the server for a file.
Okay.
So you can split your app into multiple files and only get the files you need as you're building out your app. And a lot of times, developers that like to use require, and there's a lot of them, when they're doing development, they like it to grab piecemeal the files they need. And then when you run to production, you might actually just put it through some tools with require that concatenate all your files, like we saw a moment ago with gulp, and use that in production. But one model here is they can just dynamically request files as you go. Right. So similar to Angular, in the box we've got require.js support by default, and so we recognize how you refer to different modules in require. So in this code here, I'm simply requiring a photo service, and then I'm using it in my code. And I'm getting IntelliSense for that service. I guess this one I didn't have any. There we go. Getting IntelliSense for this function that came from that service. And if we go to the definition, you'll see that it's over in another file. It's defined using requires define function. And so it's just a quick example of where we recognize that. Similarly, this code's using jQuery. And if you look, we've set up require.js here to map this jQuery name to a file path. So this is a very fast example of, beyond just seeing how to get to file paths through your require code, we're recognizing how you uniquely configure require.js. So it's simulating how the app will run versus like a subset of required.js. It actually understands how you configure the project.
Cool.
So lastly, let's talk TypeScript real quick. Here is similar code to what I just showed you, but in TypeScript. And so what I want to call out here real quick are some of the changes for the TypeScript developer in this release. As a quick refresher, if you're not familiar with TypeScript, it really lets you add types on top of JavaScript and get a tooling experience that's, it could be a higher confidence tooling experience. For example, I'm getting a squiggle here that says that it doesn't, this HTML member doesn't exist on HTML element.
Right.
So with types, we've explicitly said that getElementById returns an HTML element, and so TypeScript can say, I know this is not something in that, so it looks like an error, and tell you more definitively that you've got a problem there.
Right.
And so with JavaScript, you may not get such a nice, you know, it could dynamically show up, but we can't say for sure, so we don't give you as many messages like that. So I could come here and see, oh, okay, this is what I meant, is to assign to inner HTML. And TypeScript, you could write your app in TypeScript, you run it through the TypeScript compiler, and what comes out is just JavaScript.
Right.
So a moment ago, we saw this with Babel. With TypeScript, I could write code using, in this case, this file here is using ES 2015 features, along with I'm layering in some types. So TypeScript lets me use new ES 2015 features in my app. I could also layer in the TypeScript types. But if I remove the type code, now I've just got ES 2015 here. But TypeScript is handling it, recognizing it, and doing that transpile step for me as well.
And then you could still run it through Babel to